Howard Thurman is known as a theologian, a philosopher, and a mystic because his theology was largely based on his experience, and it engaged both the head and the heart. In his autobiography, Thurman recounts the experiences that have shaped his life and his view of God, many of which tie back to some of his earliest memories. He recalls an intimacy with the natural world that instilled in him a palpable sense of God's presence. And he found this most evident when he would spend time outside at night, or if he would spend time outside during storms. He writes that in these times his spirit felt enveloped in a way that made him feel rooted in life, in nature, and in existence. The first time he self-identified as a minister, he was actually substituting for his own pastor, much like I am today, and he received a phone call in the middle of the night to come to the hospital bed of a man who was dying. Thurman recounts the story this way, quote, "In a barely audible voice, the dying man said, 'Do you have something to say to a man who is dying? If you have, please say it, and say it in a hurry.' Thurman says, 'I bowed my head and closed my eyes. There were no words. I poured out the anguish of my desperation in one vast effort. I felt physically I was straining to reach God.'" Straining to reach God. Have you ever felt in your prayers as though you were doing that? Straining to reach God? It struck me to read that about Thurman because he's a man who seemed to have this innate connection to God. It seemed impossible to me to read that this was a man who was straining in any way to reach him. And yet, I think that's what sometimes it feels like when we are in those desperate moments praying without the words, really. Only the deep anguish that's inside of our hearts. Prayers at that time become acts in which we do very much feel like we are straining to reach God. When my reading this week, I discovered that Thurman's favorite psalm just so happened to be the one that I wanted to preach on this morning, which is 139. Now that's a favorite of a lot of people, including me, and the psalm begins this way. "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me." Now, as described by the psalm, this experience is very similar to that which Thurman himself offers us as his own experience of God. Read through Thurman's eyes, this psalm is comforting. It suggests a God who searches us and who knows us. And I think for most of us that's probably a good thing, right? And yet it continues with a statement that points to what Thurman was getting at with his comment on straining to reach God. Verse 6 reads, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it." Now, in the time before I was a Christian, I can remember this feeling of being outside among the trees, that connection to nature that Thurman talks about. Sometimes when I was among those trees, I would also climb those trees. Or I'd make my best effort at doing so. I wasn't the best tree climber. And the good news is that unlike a grown Jessica, the little Jessica did not have the same trepidation about all the creepy crawlies that might fall into my hair or other places. I didn't worry either in that time about falling out of the tree. Being up in the tree was a way that I could see the world differently. It was also a way to get away if I was playing hide and seek. If I could get up in the tree faster than the person chasing me, then I might get away. I do remember climbing one specific tree in my childhood, and not very high up into it. It wasn't a very good tree for climbing, but my best friend and I and my brother would always try to climb this tree. I remember that the world looks different when you're up in the tree. And while I'm not sure that I was climbing as high as I think I was, or even as often as I think I was, climbing was a way to expand my perspective. It was a way to get away from the too limited view that I saw from maybe 3 feet off of the ground. In those days, I thought the world would look much different when I was grown. And I'd hate to have to break it to little Jessica that even from 5 feet 4 inches and 3/4, it sometimes still looks very grim. And that's just the thing. Sometimes the world or our lives do seem grim. When we look around us, evil, no matter what its cause, seems to be present in all too many forms. Sometimes that evil is taking place outside of ourselves, and we're helpless observers. Sometimes it seems to be happening within us even. And even then, sometimes we feel helpless. I remember one day I walked over to Annie's house right past the tree that we used to climb. By then, I wasn't climbing as many trees, and Annie wasn't either because she was in the hospital being treated for leukemia. Now, I don't remember much from this particular day, but I do remember that after I had visited Annie, I came home, I went up to my bedroom and I closed the door, and I dropped to my knees at my bedside, and I prayed. I don't remember what I said. I'm sure I didn't have the words. Like the young minister Howard Thurman, I too felt that I was straining to reach God with my plea to let Annie live. Annie, you see, was the person who introduced me to Jesus. She asked me when she was 4 years old, after we had moved in next door, if I knew Jesus. And I remember thinking, well, yeah, like, sure, I know Jesus. I know who you're talking about, but I don't know the guy personally, right? But Annie did. Annie's faith is one that exemplified, in part, what we read in Psalm 139. Annie had an innate sense of God. She was able to connect in a way that I didn't understand at that time. Annie told me that she knew she would go to heaven when she died. She knew that God knew her so well because she knew that God made her. The second part of our selection from the psalm reads this way: "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth." The psalmist calls on us to remember that ours is not a God that is inactive in our existence. Ours is a God who is involved in the ongoing work of creation. A God who seeks our good, because when God made us, all of us, God called it good. We are as connected to God now as we were when we were being knitted together in the womb. Remember that. While all my straining did not save Annie, I think that it in many ways saved me. That straining did somehow bring me closer to God. I've said before that when I'm preparing a sermon, the title or the gist of the sermon often comes to me in some pop culture reference or some song or some poetry, sometimes Buffy the Vampire Slayer or something of that like. And this week it came to me through a song by a band called Missio, who plays on an alternative station on Sirius XM. And I'm sure they probably wouldn't be thrilled that I'm using their lyrics in a sermon, but I thought they were appropriate. And so, since I hope to be asked back to preach to you, I won't sing them, I'll just say them. And they go this way: "I see you when you hide, and when you lie, it's no surprise. I see you when you run from the light within your eyes. I see you when you think that I don't notice all those scars. I see you. Yes, I see you." We are seen. We don't have to strain to reach God because, whether we feel it or not, God is with us. When we try to hide, God sees us. When we lie, yes, God does see us. Whether we are up or down, God sees us. High in that house, God saw us. As I knelt crying and praying on my floor, God saw me. And as Howard Thurman strained to reach God with his anguished prayers at the bedside of the dying man, God saw everyone in that room. Ours is a God who sees us, a God who searches us and knows us, a God who knows our hearts and our minds because God formed us, knitted us together even before we were born. That's a comforting idea, I think. And yet, I think we'd be remiss if we did not address the sort of elephant in the room. And that is, what do we make of a God who created us and knows us? A God so present, as in verse 18, to be with us from our most intimate beginnings throughout our lives. What do we make of a God who is all these things, even while evil persists in the world? Well, I think it's important here to remember that while God has created us and is present with us, and many believe ultimately in control of history, God is not a puppet master, savagely creating and destroying to force evil upon the world. God is, like the Reverend Henry F. Knight says, God is actively and dynamically involved in the ongoing work of creation, to welcome life in all of its forms, even those that purposely rebel or reject the very gifts of God that make all this life possible. Evil happens for many reasons, but God is not its cause. How do we know this? Well, we know this because God incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ is evidence of that. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, came to show us that what God's love actually looks like. As we strain to reach and draw nearer to God, as we seek to more perfectly model the love of God in the example of Jesus Christ, we choose to participate in life with all its possibilities. When we choose to join God in embracing the gift to love and to be loved, we reject the voices of evil that actively work against that divine intent that Howard Thurman believed was for us to live and exist harmoniously with all other forms of existence. The last verses of this psalm, which we do not read as part of the lectionary, unfortunately, go this way. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. What we are left with at the end of this psalm really is a choice. It begins with free will. We can choose to honor the divine spark in each of us, joining the God who made us in the ongoing work of creation. Or we can choose to abandon that work and move to a path of destruction, seeking not mercy and justice and humility, but instead cruelty, inequality, and arrogance. We can choose to embrace the gifts of life and freely given grace, seeking always the goodness God wants for us. Or we can choose to push those gifts away, allowing greed, selfishness, and deceit to overtake us. We can listen to the voices of our better angels, acting in life-affirming ways that build people up. Or we can instead choose to ignore those voices and act in ways that tear down, that put up walls, and alienate us from God and from one another. To broken people, Missio's lyrics call them to run toward the light that is within themselves, to see themselves not as the lies that depression or anger or fear tell them, but to look at the way others see them. We see, the song says. And I'm telling you, and the song tells us, God sees us. Now, Howard Thurman was a man who saw through the fog of this world to God's intent for all creation to have a harmonious existence. He knew that too often we have chosen a path that has led us only to discord and to brokenness. Howard Thurman knew there was a better way, and with that better way comes a better world. And so, my friends, the question that I leave you with today is, how will you choose to live? Amen.